The child gave police a description of a man who just left the building, and an intensive search of the neighborhood began. Soon a policeman stopped a man who fit the description. They exchanged a few words, but then the man pulled a .38 caliber revolver and killed the officer. About 20 minutes later, a suspicious-looking man entered a movie house and constantly changed seats. Police were called and, after a struggle, took 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald into custody. One eyewitness to the Kennedy shooting was interviewed at the scene.
Fortunately, I was probably 15 to 20 feet away from the president when it happened. Tell us exactly what you saw, sir. He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man, it's all right, sir. He was, as he was waving back, the shot rang out, and he slumped down in the seat, and his wife reached up toward him, and as he was slumping down, and the second shot went off, and it just knocked him down from the seat. Two shots. Did you see the man who did it? No, sir, I did not see the man who did it. All I did was look in the man's face when he was shot there and saw that expression on his face and grabbed himself and slide. And the second one, whenever it went, why, I'm positive it hit him. I hope it didn't, but I'm positive it hit him, and he went all the way down in the car. Then they speeded up, and I didn't know what was going on. So
that man's raw emotion and confusion was felt by many.
The Parliament of Canada was hushed this afternoon.
Our Prime Minister Lester Pearson spoke to Canadians that day.
As I performed as Prime Minister the hard duty of announcing the sad news of the death of the President of the United States. A death so sudden and so shocking that it left us, and I'm sure it left you, stunned and unbelieving. The world can ill afford his loss. Canadians, next to Americans themselves, will feel most deeply the tragedy of that loss.
What were you doing the day that JFK died?
I was at work. I was on Donlands Avenue doing an estimate for a storefront.
How do you remember that so clearly?
It was the day JFK died. That's all.
What was your reaction when he died?
Shock, disbelief. It was hard to believe.
Absolute shock and disbelief. I immediately started to phone around to see if anybody else had heard what I'd heard, because I simply couldn't believe it. It was like a personal shock. It was as though one of the family had died. I remember it very clearly.
What do you remember about that moment?
All the telephones went dead. We couldn't get in or out or anything. I couldn't get hold of my wife to find out what had happened. And there were rumors flying around all over the place about what had happened. But that's basically all that I remember.
We all started crying. We didn't really know anything about him, but we all started crying because it seemed so violent.
What was your reaction when you found out he died?
Shock. The loss of a dear friend. My children were at school, and they were the same. We had a cheerful evening.
Why was he such a dear friend to you?
Well, I think that it's because he was like a family member. Like he came from a family, and anyone who was of a family, it made you feel. And I think that people could go to him and talk to him about things. I think he was an everyday guy.
Where were you the day Kennedy was shot?
I was in Chicago, reporter for the Associated Press, a kid. It was a long time ago. And I was sleeping. I was working the night shift, and I was sleeping, and a roommate, somebody across the hall, I lived in a little apartment building, knocked on my door and told me that Kennedy had been shot, and I ran down. I remember running down to the office of the Associated Press where I worked and spending the next 24 hours on the job, just so I had not much to do. And I kept the day's output. I remember I kept the wire copy for the day for years, 10 years or so. I probably still have it somewhere in the basement.
American Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh has worked for several newspapers and wire services in the United States. In hindsight, he feels the Kennedy years were not as good as their publicity.
I was fooled by Camelot too. I think Jack Kennedy introduced an awful lot of new words into the American dictionary. Nation building, counterinsurgency, fortified hamlet, strategic hamlet, Green Berets. I'm sorry to say that I'm convinced that Jack Kennedy would have prosecuted the war as vigorously as Lyndon Johnson did in Vietnam. I don't believe that he would have backed off. I think he often confused his own sense of machismo with foreign policy. He felt that he had to show Nikita Khrushchev that he was as good a man as he thought Khrushchev was. And I'm less and less happy about the Kennedy presidency.
At the time, how did you see it?
Oh, it was wonderful. We had a president who everybody knew was sleeping around and was an attractive guy.
Did you know that then?
Sure. People in the press knew it. He knew it from the Secret Service people. You know, that anytime the president would come into a city, he apparently, as they say, was very glandular. And he would get into the city and the Secret Service would have to work with the local cops, and there would always be some sort of funny maneuver in a hotel. He'd always be in one hotel, and then he'd split out back door and go meet some chick somewhere in some other hotel, and he'd have a couple of cops and a couple of Secret Service men with him. And in the press, there was this wonderful double standard that doesn't exist quite so extensively today, which is that we all knew the secret. And when he was here, he went to his quarters in the Drake Hotel down the block without the press knowing it, to see some, chick or whatever.
When you look back now on how he was assassinated and the assassination theory, what do you make of that?
Well, I found that in my own personal career, I think I've saved anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million man-hours by not becoming a nut about the assassination. And one of my basic theories is once the statute of limitations was up and nobody came forward to publish a book about how I did it, or nobody moved to the Fiji Islands to make the $5 million or $10 million that would be available, maybe Oswald did do it. I'm now more and more convinced that, of course, as we learn much more about the inadequacy of the various investigations, the Warren Commission, I'm convinced that we missed a big opportunity to do an honest investigation back in '63 and '64 when the trail was still reasonably warm. And I'm more and more skeptical of the reasons Jack Ruby shot Oswald.
In what way?
Well, just instinct would tell me it's not quite as simple as it seems. Somebody just got mad at Oswald and is a good patriot with his sort of shaggy background. Ruby would assassinate him. Somebody had to put him up to it, I would suggest. But, I have no basis for knowing that. I think the trail is much too cold now.
And CBC national newscaster Knowlton Nash was in Washington at the time Kennedy was killed. Toronto Star newspaper correspondent Jack Braille covered JFK's many political campaigns right up until his election as president. And thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us today. What do you remember about the day in Washington when Kennedy was assassinated?
Actually, I wasn't in Washington. I was in Miami coming back from Latin America and arrived back in Washington late that Friday night after his body had come back from Dallas. And then from Friday night through midnight Monday, it was a whirlwind of work and emotions. And I don't think, for me personally, it didn't really hit until Sunday when the body was being taken from the White House up to Capitol Hill where it lay in state. And there was no time to think, really, because you're working so hard, till that point. And that was then it suddenly imploded inside me what had happened and what kind of loss there had been.
And then what was your reaction?
Well, I suppose, it's been said before, and I think it's very true, you realize, in a sense, you'd never be young again.
You followed JFK through his campaign trail. He was neck and neck with Nixon. No one ever thought a Catholic president could ever become a president in the United States. What was that campaign like? What did you learn about the man through the campaign?
Well, I would disagree with you that nobody thought a Catholic president could be elected. I thought that he was going to swamp Nixon myself. I was completely wrong on that. As far as Kennedy was concerned, I noticed that George Bain yesterday referred to him as being the most compelling public figure he'd ever seen. And I think I'd agree with that, yes.
What was that charisma he
Well,
had?
the same charisma he still has, that he was just so alive. That's one of the odd things about realizing it's 20 years since he died, is that he's still so much more alive than a lot of people who are walking around the streets.
Do we assess his presidency as a result of his personality or as a result of his political contributions?
Oh, I think we assess it essentially on his personality. I think his zest, his promise, Because after all, he didn't really accomplish legislatively that much. Lyndon Johnson really fulfilled his own program. What he left us, I guess, was a sense of idealism, a sense of youth, a sense of vitality, and a sense of promise. And it's that we really revere now more than the actual presidential accomplishments. Mind you, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, that kind of thing, that was certainly a major crisis because the world came closer to a nuclear war then than it was before or ever has been since. And he handled that in a way in which was, well, I guess it's a fulfillment of his favorite phrase of grace under pressure.
You spent the evening with the Kennedy family after he'd been elected.
Well, the afternoon after his election, he invited the national press who had been on his campaign, who happened to be in Hyannis, over to his father's house, Joe's house. We sat around for a couple of hours. Rose Kennedy made and served milk punch. Jack sat, and I remember I can see him sitting on the couch beside Ben Bradley, who was a great friend of his from the Washington Post. He seemed very relaxed. In spite of that bad back, he had tremendous grace, and I can see him, Jackie, who was within 3 weeks of giving birth to John Jr. Jackie went upstairs at one stage, and the impression was that she wasn't feeling well. So Jack Kennedy went up the stairs after her to see how she was, taking two steps at a time. He looked, he was 42, 43 at the time, and he was as live as a 26-year-old.
Was it a jubilant mood?
Kind of tired. Everybody was tired.
This was Joe Kennedy's dream, of course.
Joe Kennedy wasn't there.
I realize
Joe Kennedy stayed away. I don't think I ever saw him during
the campaign.
He knew that he could do nothing but harm to.
His money was useful, but his presence was undesirable.
What about the karma of the Kennedy family when you look back on it? Because of Joe Kennedy's desire and ambition for his son, and when you look at the tragedy that ensued in the family, what do you make of that now?
Well, I don't think the tragedies ensued because of the ambitions of the father, but there certainly was a lot of tragedy in the family. Son Joe killed, daughter killed in a plane crash, other daughter in a mental hospital, and then subsequently 2 sons, both Robert and Jack, assassinated. The family made enormous contributions, I think, to the American scene, paid an enormous price for that. Just a terrible price.
And yet, the glibness and the wit during the news broadcast and how he handled the media, he was a master at it.
He was. I wouldn't call him glib. He had a marvelous wit and a self-deprecatory wit. He always had that. And he was very, very quick, right? He was extraordinarily quick, either at press conferences or in private conversations, even long before he became president. In those days, you could get to know people fairly well, and I can remember spending many, many hours with him in his Senate office building when he was with the Senate Labor Rackets Committee, when he was a member of that committee, and you'd trail up to his office after, and it was fun. He was fun to be with. He was stimulating to be with. He had a zest for life that communicated itself, and he liked reporters. He liked newsmen, and it was reciprocated.
And yet when we look back at the revisionism that's happened, particularly in the last 10 years over Kennedy and his presidency, there are many journalists who now comment on his lack of morality, and not just what Seymour Hersh talked about, but when you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis and the way it was handled, they attribute that to a certain lack of moral judgment.
But the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the greatest success stories in the post-war era. It was enormously successful. It was, it demonstrated, I don't think any president, anybody has ever quite handled a crisis in the way in which he did. A minimum force, totally open communication with your adversary in that case. It seemed to me to be a classic study of how to handle a crisis. It was a terrific success story. I have a terrible feeling that so much of the revisionist historian work is really, it's very profitable, as has been proven by the number of books and so on that have been written by revisionist historians. I don't think it necessarily has much to do with reality.
Would he increase the troops in Vietnam, do you think?
I think not. I think he did increase them. They went from a few hundred to something like 15,000, 18,000 by the time his presidency had finished, but he In the latter years especially, he had always talked about getting out and how to get out. He talked about that with Mike Pearson, about how to get out. I think he would have gotten out. He never would have become entrapped as Johnson did, ever.
He was very fond of Mike Pearson and not very fond, apparently, of John Diefenbaker, a fact to which John Diefenbaker apparently never did get over. Are you aware of that?
Oh, yes. He hated Diefenbaker.
Yes, and Diefenbaker, yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was... Bobby Kennedy once told me over at his house at Hickory Hill that his brother hated only two people during his lifetime. One was Sukarno and the other was Diefenbaker.
What was the reason for this passionate hate?
Well, I think he felt Diefenbaker was a poseur, a braggart. They just weren't on the same wavelength at all. They had so little in common.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Kennedy was in no way a phony.
Oh, no.
And he may well have thought that Diefenbaker
Well, he certainly did, yeah.
And yet again, we're reminded always of the hypocrisy of believing in civil rights and yet having Martin Luther King's phones tapped, that he would follow Hoover's orders to see whether or not he was involved with...
I think you go much too far when you say hypocrisy. I think if you said indifference in the 1950s, I think you would have been, that was more accurate. I think as the presidency evolved, as the whole thing involved with Mississippi and so on, I think that he changed very profoundly, and in fact he appointed more blacks to senior positions than any other president had done up to that time.
Was there this bright spot in Camelot?
Sure there was.
What was that?
Sure there was. Personally, I think that the important thing to me about Kennedy is not whether or not Kennedy had these women, not whether he was privately arrogant, but what he did to the rest of us. We were waiting. This was a generation which had, as children, seen the Depression, had seen the war. Things were pretty bad in the race issue in the States, the Cold War. We were waiting for somebody with confidence, somebody who could tell us that we could be better than we had been. And he made us feel that we were. He may not have been entirely what we thought he was, but I think we were a little better for a while.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think Kennedy essentially took us for what we could be. Everybody else in the White House, I think, subsequently has taken us for what we are. And I'd rather... He had a capacity to stretch people.
What place do you think he'll hold in our national psyche?
Our, meaning Canadian national psyche? I think he is there, as Jack has described, as an inspiration. And again, he was cut off before the promise could be translated into reality, and therefore one never knows. I think he was a good president. I notice that historians generally rank him about number 13th in all the presidents of the United States. I think he could have been a good president. I don't think he necessarily was a great president.
Is it an opportunity lost, in a sense, that we never will know now?
Well, there were some things happened that couldn't have gone worse. I'll put it that way. I can't tell you. No one was in Washington during his presidency. I wasn't. I do think, I do look back, though, and think that we did have some heroes. And I don't know who our heroes are now. I don't see too many Kennedys, too many Adlai Stevensons.
But the JFK story will be a story we will all pass on to our children and to our grandchildren.
Oh, I think that's true. And it is an opportunity lost, as you say.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.